Hey there, students. We're going to continue today talking about major events of the European theater. The last time we left off, we talked about the Battle of Britain and how the British RAF, the Royal Air Force, defeated the German Luftwaffe and prevented a German invasion of Britain. Now, with Britain, with the invasion of Britain out of the question, Adolf Hitler decided to look to the east because his overall goal was eventually to invade the Soviet Union. So even though Germany and the Soviet Union had signed this non-aggression pact before the war began, Hitler had always intended to violate that non-aggression pact and invade the Soviet Union. This was part of Hitler's idea of Lebensraum, which, if you remember, that was the idea of that Hitler wanted to create more living space for Germany. And he wanted to use this territory in the east, the land, to farm it, to resettle it with German settlers, to farm the land, and to use those resources to help supply Germany. And he also wanted to use the Russians, the Slavic peoples, as almost like a slave labor force. And then also any Jewish people that were in that area, he wanted to have those Jewish people eventually shipped to concentration camps or killed on spot, even as part of the Holocaust. So Hitler launches this invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. Um, and initially, the invasion goes very well for Germany. So the German forces, they kind of have a three-prong attack, three different armies that are going into the Soviet Union, and these armies are going dozens and dozens of miles into Russia, and eventually get within 25 miles of Moscow. Now, eventually, there are Soviet counterattacks, and then also weather conditions that prevent the Germans, from capturing Moscow. And so the advance kind of stalls in the fall and winter of 1941, and they try to resume it again the next year, but they're never able to build up that momentum again. Now, the invasion of the Soviet Union comes to a turning point at this Battle of Stalingrad. Now, Stalingrad was the name of a city within the Soviet Union, and it wasn't that very strategically important for the Germans to capture this city, but Hitler wanted to capture the city because it bore Stalin's name, and he wanted to wipe the city from the face of the earth. So the Germans spent a lot of effort trying to capture the city, even though it may not have been worth it for them. Now, once the Germans did, capture at least part of the city, there was, door-to-door combat. There was, fighting in the streets, fighting in all these, burned out buildings and bombed out buildings. The Soviets used basically a frozen lake river to launch this counterattack that ends up encircling the German army and trapping them within the city of Stalingrad itself. And then after several months of fighting to get out of the city, that German army group ends up surrendering. So we're talking tens of thousands of German soldiers that end up having to surrender to the Soviets. Now, this is a significant victory for the Soviets because after the Battle of Stalingrad, now the Soviet army is going to be on the advance. So for basically the entire war, the Germans had been on the advance. And now we see that now the Soviets, now one of the Allied powers, is going to be on the advance, pushing the Germans back towards Berlin. This is really the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. And just like Napoleon was defeated trying to invade the Soviet Union, Hitler also failed to invade the Soviet Union. Now, once Hitler invades the Soviet Union, now the Soviet Union swings over to officially join the Allies. And then remember, after the Battle of Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese bombed the naval base at Pearl Harbor, now the United States is also part of the Allies. So Britain is no longer alone. So now Britain has the United States and the Soviet Union on their side. And these are the big three countries that are now part of the Allied powers. So the leaders of these countries decide to meet at Tehran, which is the capital city of Iran. And so the leader of Great Britain is Winston Churchill. He's the prime minister. The leader of the Soviet Union is Joseph Stalin, and the president of the United States at the time is Franklin Roosevelt. And they all meet together in Tehran to discuss war aims, to discuss the goals that the Allies are trying to achieve. And one of the main things that was being talked about at this conference was that the other allies, so in this case Britain and the United States, agreed to open up a second front in Western Europe against the Germans. And the idea was basically to force the Germans to fight a two-front war, just like in World War I, where they're fighting the Soviets on the Eastern Front, but now at the same time, they're going to have to fight the British and the United States on the Western Front. Now, this plan comes to fruition with the Battle of D-Day, also known as the Invasion of Normandy. So basically, British and American troops were stationed in Britain, and they used that as a jump-off point to cross the English Channel, and they invade a region of northern France called Normandy. And there are they basically go out in these naval vessels. They transfer from the naval vessels to these landing craft, as you can see in this picture right here. These landing craft come up on the beaches of Normandy, and they open up and unleash these soldiers on the beaches, and the British and the American soldiers and Canadian soldiers basically fight their way to get control of a beachhead. And then once the beachhead is secured, then they can start bringing in more men, more supplies, vehicles, those kinds of things. Now, D-Day, before D-Day, that region of France was heavily defended. In fact, a very well-known German general named Erwin Rommel had constructed a series of fortifications along the coast of France that was called the Atlantic Wall. And, it seemed like, these defenses would be very difficult to surpass. Now, there were some weather problems that ended up delaying the D-Day invasion, and these weather problems actually convinced the Germans that the invasion wasn't going to come for some time. So Erwin Rommel actually wasn't even in the Normandy region of France when the D-Day invasion took place. So the response, to the invasion was somewhat muted on the German side. And then also, Hitler was always convinced that this D-Day, invasion was actually going to come somewhere else. And so he didn't want to, commit his reserves to Normandy because he felt like that this was just a diversion and that the real invasion was going to come at a different location. So that also muted, the German response. So the Allies do end up securing this beachhead, and they do end up putting men on the beach. So within 3 months after these D-Day landings, the Allies end up landing, 2 million men, 500,000 vehicles. And this kind of shows you the industrial might of the United States, that they're just able to commit. We had all these factories in the United States putting out all this military equipment, and we're just able to put so much more men and material into combat at this point in time than the Germans could. Now, once we land at Normandy, France, the British and the Americans then move, and we end up liberating Paris in August of 1944, and we begin plans to move into Germany and come at Germany from the west, while the Soviets are coming into Germany from the east. Now, right before the British and the Americans begin their push into Germany, the Germans launch one final offensive to try to push, the Allies back, and they want to actually, the Germans want to drive their forces to the coast and gain access to the coast again. So they launch this one final offensive, and this battle comes to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, because basically there were these battle lines, and then once the Germans pushed, the Allies had to kind of fall back, and that created an indent in the lines. It created this bulge in the Allied lines, and that's where the battle gets its name from. Now, there was actually one area of the line that didn't get pushed back, and this was a line that had, or an area that had paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division that ended up becoming surrounded because they never retreated by German soldiers. And they ended up holding out around a city called Bastogne, and eventually were rescued once the Allies gained back all that lost territory. So, like I said, this invasion, this German offensive, and eventually ran out of steam. They couldn't continue the advance for very long, and so the Allies end up taking all the lost territory in January of 1945. All right, that's it for today.